In this video, we are going to cover two critical tools in Lightroom to take your images to the next level. So let's get started. The first is related to the histogram. So I find many photographers do not use the histogram in their editing like they do in their camera settings. So the histogram is one of the most powerful tools to ensure that you are getting a solid edit to your image. So let's first review the histogram. If you're new to photography and new to editing, your histogram, you want to keep this open at the top of your screen, and it's giving you your camera data for your image. So the data starts with your blacks over here on the left, then it moves to your shadows, over to your exposure, which goes through the middle of your image, then your highlights, and then your whites. So we go from whites all the way over to blacks. Now, the number one mistake that I find is people do not turn on these blinkies. So if you click this little arrow, triangle lifting up on the corners here of the histogram panel, these are going to give you your warnings. So it's letting us know that our blacks or our shadows are what's called clipped. It means that we've lost detail and data in this area. So if I turn it off, you will notice that the blacks are just really bunched up. It's just super, super dark and deep. And that may be okay, but what it's telling us is it's not going to print very good. And it's just not a proper exposure, and we're losing the detail. Now, it may be that for some reason, this is a silhouette. There could be reasons that you want your blacks to look like this. But in a typical image, we don't want our blacks to be clipped like this. We want them to have a little bit more detail coming out in our image. Now, on the opposite side, the highlights, we can see that we've got some blown areas. So this is an image that often you're going to run into when you're out shooting in the field. Maybe you don't have your tripod, you're on just a photo walk, and it's a bright day. And you've got a scene where you've got a bright sky, you've got the shadows over here in the garden, you've got shadows in the building, and you have to choose somewhere to expose. So when you bring it into post-processing, we now can see the areas that are a little bit blown out. And what that means is that our highlights have been clipped. We've got some areas that are a little bit too bright. It's not a lot, but just a little bit. All right, so now that we understand and we've turned on our blinkies, we can now correct these areas. And that's the first thing that you want to do when you begin editing an image. You want to look to see if there's any areas that are under or overexposed or clipped, and you want to go ahead and make those adjustments. So how do we make those adjustments? Well, we're going to come down here to the basic panel, and we're going to start with the histogram. You have your highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and open up our shadows, and we can instantly see. Now, this image was shot in RAW, so I do have a lot of detail and information. I'm also going to open up the blacks, bring those over. So now look at all that detail we have in the tree. It's much more detailed than before. You can see how dark it is. And then, of course, now. So a very, very difference in the tree detail and in getting us that nice exposure. Now for our highlights, I'm going to just bring those over. And we also, looks like now, if we look at our histogram, we've brought those highlights over off this clipped edge, and also our blacks are over. So now we don't have any area that's clipped or kind of crunched up. Now, if you're an advanced Lightroom user and you like to use mask would be another way that you could edit this image and correct those areas. I have a series of videos on masking, and the benefit is masking allows you to make selective adjustments to parts of your image, correcting for things like your shadows, your highlights, those kinds of things. So that would be an advanced way that you could also alter those areas. All right, so let's look at another image, and I will give you a second example. So if we look at this histogram, and we've got on our blinkies, we don't have any area that's clipped. So we're not getting any warning on our blacks or our whites, but we can see that our histogram does not go all the way across. There's not any data really over here in our highlights or our whites. So this is the second mistake or second editing tip that I want to give you. A lot of people will begin to edit an image like this by pumping the exposure. So we come over and we're like, we're going to brighten this image up. But that's not really doing much for our image. It's kind of making it a little hazy. We're losing some detail. And all we've done is move the histogram over. When we shoot in RAW, we actually have data in the whites and the highlights. It just isn't visible right now because we underexposed this image when we shot it. So what I want to encourage you to do is actually always start with these areas in editing your image. Start with your histogram. We want to come over and we're going to open up the whites. So we're going to slide those over. Look at how our histogram is stretched now. It goes all the way from the blacks over, and we do have a little bit of data here in the whites and the highlights. Now our highlights are not too bright, but I'm going to bring them down just a little bit because they're a little bit there. But now I'm going to open up our shadows. So I'm just going to see what that does to the image. Just kind of opening those up a little bit. And I could also open up the blacks if I wanted. I think the blacks are fine. They're all the way here. So now I have a much better stretched histogram, and you can see the before versus the after. Now again, if I had come over and left the whites and just pumped the exposure, very different than if I open up the whites. So that is tip number 2, is as you begin editing an image, the first thing you want to do, look at your histogram, think about what needs to be edited, and then use your tools right here in the basic panel to make those adjustments. So let's go and look at another image. I'm going to pick another one with a different scenario. So this one we can see we've got our blinkies on and nothing is crunched up. So we don't have a true problem with the image, but our exposure is very heavy again to the dark side. So some of you may tend to expose on the bright side. I tend to expose on the dark side. So I often have to open up my histogram. So this is where, again, I'm not going to just open up exposure. That looks like the easy route to take. What I want to do is start down here with my whites. I'm going to open those up. I'm going to maybe bring down the highlights just a little bit. I am going to open up the shadows, bringing out that detail behind the image. And that's really all I needed to do for this. So let's look at before and let's look at after. Now, if I wanted that background to be a little darker, I could leave the shadows. I don't have to open those. There's no error. The shadows are fine. They're not clipped. But if I want to bring out a little bit of that detail, I could open them up. And then I could open up the whites. Now let's look at an image that's a little bit brighter. So this histogram is actually, it's spread pretty nice from the blacks all the way over, and nothing is blown out. So with this image, I don't have a lot to modify. I could decide if I wanted to adjust the highlights, if I don't want it quite as bright. If I move the whites over, it's probably helping brighten up these reds just a little bit. But this would be an example where the histogram looks pretty good. I don't want to alter all this bright color around the flower. So this is where I would use those advanced tools of probably coming in with a mask, which is this circle here, grabbing my brush and enlarging the brush, and maybe just going into this darker, more of the shadow area of the image. And I'm being very selective now with where I want to impact it. And then I'm going to come over to my whites because I do have room right here on the histogram. And I'm going to come over and just open up the whites in that area a little bit. And maybe open up the shadows just to brighten that. Now I could also give it a little exposure bump if I wanted to, just a tiny bit. And let's click done. So now we can see before, especially if you look in this area, you can see before it's a little dark, and now I've just brightened it just a little bit in these petals. So that's a way to use the mask tool to be very selective when you're opening up your highlight shadows or your whites, blacks. So just to recap, when you start editing your image, it's really important as you take a new image into Lightroom to look at your histogram at the top. Be sure you've got your blinkies turned on, and then begin editing or tweaking your highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. You can always go out a little bit of exposure if you want it, but start with getting a balanced, really nice histogram, and then from there you can make additional edits with the tools available in Lightroom.